John Wesley, who was an Anglican priest, like Episcopal priest, who felt like the Anglican worship and what people were getting out of that was not spiritual, and it was kind of a go through the motions thing. So Wesley and some other people started what were called, they were made fun of, and they were called holy clubs. But they said, look, there are these methods that we need to do to move closer to God. And so it's not just worship, but it's also small groups of people coming together to watch over one another in love. And then, pretty soon there were classes and there were bands, and many of those people were still Anglican in membership. Okay. But they were Methodist in practice, but it wasn't a church. It was a movement. It was a spiritual renewal movement. And because the Industrial Revolution was going on over there in England at that time, and in it spread to other parts of Ireland and so forth, it really resonated with people who were displaced and from the country, and they were coming into town. And the basic nuts and bolts of Methodism were, this is a renewal movement. It's to renew people's faith and move them closer to God and closer to the Christian community. So everything I just said, if you've paid attention even a little bit, you know that you hear those kinds of things often in what I preach and teach here at Grandview, because that movement, the Methodist movement, came across the ocean to the colonies. And so before the American Revolution, here in what we now think of as the United States, you had all these Anglican people who also identified as Methodist. And so that worked because there were Anglican priests here in America to baptize babies, serve communion, and do that kind of thing. And then the Methodist people did their class meetings and Bible studies and works of service and love as part of being Anglican. Well, then the American Revolutionary War came, and almost all of the Anglican priests went home to England. So the Methodist people were over here. The American Revolution ends, and they're writing letters to John Wesley, which of course take like 3 or 4 months to get to him, saying, "Hey, what are we supposed to do? We're still meeting in Christian community, but we have babies to baptize, and we want to take, communion." And they respected that. And so Methodism really truly is an American-born church. Okay, so it was a movement, came to the United States. And so Wesley ordained from England, he ordained Thomas Coke, Francis Asbury to be bishops. And then bishops had the authority to ordain elders and appoint pastors. And so Methodism began to grow as a movement, and it really was a revival, still a revival movement. And because of our system, our uniqueness of circuit riders is where we started, is that the Methodist circuit riders literally traveled with the pioneers as they moved across America from east to west. Is that many circuit riders would go with them, and they would establish a meeting house, like a church building, and then a class meeting, and the circuit riders would keep going. And so Methodism literally spread across the United States very quickly, as opposed to some of the other denominations. They also were moving quickly, including the Catholics, but they tended to build, brick buildings and try to get located and have their priests and their pastors in place. And so that's one of the differences, where the Methodists started out very nimble and very quick. Now, let me bring that to Dubuque. Okay. So in Iowa, the first class meeting was held in the Quad Cities. And so you had some Methodist people. They're in the Quad City area. They're pioneers. They crossed the river, or they came up from St. Louis. And they said, "Hey, we want this class meeting, like what we think of as our cell groups." And so a class meeting started there. But then if you go downtown to Washington Square Park here in Dubuque, you can find a plaque in the park that gives a real brief history of the circuit riding preacher that crossed the frozen Mississippi River and preached the first sermon in a tavern located about where the Julian Dubuque Hotel is. And of course, taverns were both, a place to eat and drink and stay. And so what came from that then was the Washington Square, what we think of now as the Washington Square church that was built downtown Washington Square Park, that became St. Luke's United Methodist Church. So that was the very first Methodist church in Iowa. Was downtown. And just for Trivial Pursuit purposes, if you go to the Iowa State Fair, on the grounds of the Iowa State Fair is a replica of that log church that's set down in Washington Square Park here in Dubuque. And it's still there, and it's identified as Iowa's first Protestant church. And they do hymn sings there. And again, that's Trivial Pursuit. But what happened is then Methodism had a foothold here in Iowa's first city, really, in Dubuque. So it began to spread, and everybody thinks of, obviously, as Dubuque as the German Catholics and the Irish Catholics, which is a fact. They were here strongly. So were the Methodist people. The Methodist people were here strongly. They got that foothold down at Washington Square Chapel, but then they pushed on, and places like Asbury. So Asbury became, I gave that history several years ago because we have the communion table from Asbury United Methodist Church is at the front of our church. Asbury, of course, was named after Francis Asbury, one of the first bishops here in the United States. And so some Methodist people were out in the Asbury area, some farmers, and they said, we want to do a class meeting and we want to, keep this movement going, this spiritual renewal thing. And so before long, they built their church. At the same time, the circuit riders and the Methodist people kept pushing on. And so the next really important place here in our area and in Iowa was Epworth. So Epworth was named after John Wesley's hometown in England. And so Epworth Church was planted, I think, next. And it then became kind of a training school. So what's now the Catholic seminary out there, what's the name? Divine Word? Originally, that was the beginnings of a very small Methodist preacher training school in Epworth, Iowa. And so the circuit riders would come there to get some training, not like a Master's of Divinity or anything else. They came in there to get the basic essentials of how to preach and lead worship and do the sacraments and those sorts of things. And then here in Dubuque County, that's some really strong Methodist heritage right here that a lot of people don't know about. It's like hiding in plain sight. Then you had Center Grove was founded, and it was its own town. Rockdale was founded. That was its own little railroad town. And Methodists helped settle that and build a church there. And then Reed's Chapel was a little Methodist congregation that's out what we think of now as North Cascade Road and English Mill Road, the intersection of those. Back in the weeds, there's some tombstones that are in this guy's yard. And that was where Reed's Chapel Church was located. And so, by mid 1800s, I think Reed's Chapel was 1839. Anyway, before 1900, the Methodist people in Dubuque had spread out. St. Luke's and Rockdale, Center Grove, Reed's Chapel, Asbury, and so the circuit riders would do this and then move on to next churches. And then Grandview, of course, was birthed from St. Luke's. And so the St. Luke's folks said, we have an opportunity to put a Methodist class meeting and Sunday school on the edge of Dubuque, which was originally that 5 Point by Finley Hospital and the dry cleaner and on Grandview Avenue. So that was the edge of Dubuque. That was like the frontier, And so there's pictures in our Hall of Fame, our wall of history here at Dubuque, that shows the house where the first Sunday school met there. And then that grew into one church that's the first Grandview building, Grandview Avenue Methodist Church, was where like the tax accounting place is right next to the Lutheran church there. And that wasn't a good church. So they built, I think, a second structure where Mike's dry cleaner is. And then they built the next building, which is still standing, where the Greek Orthodox Church was. But again, that's some of the background of some history here of Methodism and more importantly, the Methodist movement and how powerful it was in literally helping settle and bring order to our part of the world.